All right, so diving right in. Today we're going deep on Kristin Hannah's newest novel, The Women.
Ooh, exciting.
It's set during the Vietnam War, historical fiction. We've got a couple of sources lined up to really, get into it.
Okay.
First up, we've got the Wikipedia article, like good overview and all that.
Yeah, yeah.
But then also, we found this really cool piece from an Italian magazine. Gives us kind of a different angle.
Oh, interesting. I always like seeing how different sources frame a book, especially one with this much buzz around it.
Buzz, definitely. I mean, they did a huge EG first printing.
Didn't they do like 1 million copies or something crazy like that?
Yeah, a million. That's wild, right? Talk about confidence.
Well, Hannah's got a pretty solid track record. I mean, The Nightingale was like a global phenomenon.
Total phenomenon, yeah. So I guess readers are, ready to see what she does with this new historical setting.
For sure. Although, thinking about it, the Vietnam War, it's been done a lot, Books, movies, the whole deal. So I'm really curious what makes this story stand out. What fresh take can Hannah bring to the table?
Good point. And it's interesting you say that because actually this Italian article I was reading mentioned that The Women hasn't gotten the, warmest reception across the board.
Really?
Yeah, some reviewers found the plot a bit predictable.
Huh. Well, predictability in historical fiction, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right?
Not so.
On the one hand, people come to historical fiction expecting certain things, familiar narratives. Like, they want that historical world, but they also want a good story, right?
Right.
But then at the same time, as readers, we always want to be surprised, kept on our toes.
Definitely. So then what were these reviewers like? Like, what exactly did they find predictable in The Women?
Well, they pointed to things like Frankie, the main character. They pointed to her brother's death in Vietnam
Well, okay.
and her decision to become a nurse after. Those plot points, they're emotionally heavy, for sure.
Right.
But I guess they felt a bit like, we've seen this before in war stories.
Okay. Yeah, I could see that. But I mean, don't you think there's something to be said for the power of those familiar stories?
Sure.
Like, even if we sort of know where the plot's going, a really good writer, someone like Hannah, can still make us feel those emotions, really deeply.
Absolutely. I mean, think about that scene where Frankie is handed a boot
Oh, yeah.
with a foot still in it.
Yeah.
Horrifying. And even though, yeah, maybe we could see it coming, it's still so powerful, so visceral,
Totally. Like, it's the way it's written. It reminds me of that scene in Saving Private Ryan. Remember when the medic's trying to save that soldier and it's just blood pouring out?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Just heartbreaking.
It's the execution, the emotional nuance that makes it hit hard. But it's also, I think, about what those predictable elements allow the story to do.
What do you mean?
Well, those plot points we talked about. The brother's death, Frankie becoming a nurse, they let Hannah shift focus onto something really unique. The perspective of women during the Vietnam War.
Oh, now that's interesting. I mean, we've heard so many stories about the soldiers on the front lines.
Right.
But how often do we hear about the nurses? Their experiences, the sacrifices, the unique challenges they faced.
It's a gap, for sure. And that's where I think The Women has potential, really digging into this corner of history that often gets overlooked, giving voice to those unsung heroes. And it's not just nurses in general,
Yeah.
Hannah specifically focuses on Army nurses during Vietnam.
Right.
They had a whole different set of challenges compared to, civilian nurses back home.
Oh, for sure. And, that actually reminds me of something the Wikipedia article mentioned about Hannah herself.
Yeah.
She grew up during the Vietnam War era. Like, she even wore a POW bracelet.
Wow.
And it said she saw, firsthand how divisive the war was for people.
Yeah.
Families, communities, all that.
Wow, that's heavy. Makes you think how much of her own experience, her own, wrestling with those issues, how much of that is in the novel?
Right. It definitely adds this whole other layer, knowing it comes from such a personal place.
Totally.
And speaking of personal, oh my gosh, this blew my mind. The Wikipedia article said she actually came up with the idea for this story 20 years ago.
No way! Seriously?
Yeah. It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what finally made her decide to write it now after all this time?
I know. It's like she was waiting for the right moment, the right, I don't know, feeling or something to bring these characters and their stories to life.
Yeah. Yeah, like the world had to catch up or something.
Maybe. And I wonder if there's a connection to, what we've all been through recently.
Like what?
Think about the pandemic. COVID.
Oh, okay, yeah.
All of a sudden, healthcare workers, they were front and center. We saw their sacrifices, how strong they had to be, how dedicated, even with all the risk.
That's a good point. Both the Vietnam War and the pandemic, they force us to really see the human cost of these huge events
Yeah.
and the role that nurses, all healthcare workers, really play in those times.
It's like those shared experiences, that feeling of like being vulnerable but also resilient. It made a space for a story like The Women to hit differently, maybe.
I see what you mean. I wonder if Hannah, back when she first had this idea, could she have pictured the world we're in now?
Yeah.
Where, we really get it, the sacrifices nurses and frontline workers make.
It's like the world had to catch up to the story she wanted to tell. But even beyond the historical stuff, this Italian article brought up something really interesting about characters in war literature.
Okay, what's that?
It said the characters that really grab you, they often seem like the ones who are most likely to die.
Oh, wow. It's like they're set up that way.
Yeah, almost like foreshadowing. Right.
Right, right.
You feel how vulnerable they are, and it just pulls you deeper into their story.
It raises the stakes, for sure. Makes you realize how fragile life is, especially in war.
Exactly. And it ties back to what we were saying about predictability. Even if you kind of see it coming, a character's fate,
Yeah.
the way the author writes those emotional moments, it still packs a punch.
Absolutely. So it sounds like even if The Women has some familiar plot points, it's really Hannah's writing, the emotional depth and her fresh perspective on this historical event that makes it stand out.
Totally. And for anyone thinking, ugh, another Vietnam War story, I'd say this one's about the women who lived through it.
Their bonds, the sacrifices they made, how it all stayed with them even after the war ended.
Exactly.
It's about resilience, sisterhood, and how trauma, how it sticks with you. I think a lot of listeners, even if they haven't been through war, they'll connect with Frankie's journey.
For sure. It's about those universal things, right? Dealing with tough relationships, making hard choices, trying to find meaning when the world feels crazy.
Exactly. Oh, and this is interesting. The Wikipedia article talked about why Hannah chose the Vietnam War, specifically for the women. She was really drawn to how it divided people, tore families apart, even whole communities.
It's a powerful element in the story. And honestly, it's still so relevant today, right? With all the division we see, how polarized everything feels.
It makes you think about how history, it keeps playing out in the present. Like the lessons we learn or don't learn, they shape the choices we make now.
Absolutely. That's what's so great about historical fiction. It lets us really engage with the past in a way that feels meaningful.
Yeah.
We can see the connections between then and now, and maybe even find some comfort or guidance in the stories of those who came before us.
It's funny, as we've been talking about the women, it really struck me how good Hannah is at writing. Like those complicated female relationships.
Oh, totally.
I mean, even in The Nightingale, the heart of that story was the bond between the two sisters, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that whole theme of sisterhood, it's front and center in The Women, too.
Right.
These nurses, they're thrown together in the most intense situation imaginable, and they form these incredibly strong connections.
Makes you think war is obviously horrific, but it can also create those kind of bonds, right?
Yeah.
Where you have to rely on each other, share those burdens, find comfort in the middle of all the chaos.
And it's interesting, those bonds that are formed in war, they often last way beyond the actual fighting,
Yeah, it's like they've been through something so big together.
Yeah.
So life-changing that the connection just transcends time and distance.
It's like they have this shared language, a way of understanding each other that only they can really get.
Exactly. And I think that's something Hannah captures so well in The Women. It's not just about, being buddies and supporting each other. It's also about the challenges they face, the sacrifices they make, the emotional toll that the war takes on them.
For sure. Even if they're not the ones on the front lines, literally fighting, they're still seeing those horrors firsthand, dealing with the aftermath, caring for the wounded, comforting those who are dying.
Yeah.
Witnessing those scars, the physical and emotional ones that war leaves behind.
It's heavy stuff.
And on top of all that, they're dealing with their own personal stuff too, right? Their own fears and doubts.
It's a lot to carry. And I think that's what makes their stories so important to hear, It reminds us that war isn't just about battles and politics. It's about the human cost, the individuals whose lives are forever changed by conflict.
Exactly. And it's about seeing the strength of those who serve, especially women who often face such unique challenges during the war and afterward, too.
Absolutely. So if you're looking for a story that really digs into what it means to be human, a story about the power of connection and how war leaves its mark, then The Women is worth checking out.
And as you read it, think about this. How do the experiences of war, especially for women, how do those things shape their lives and perspectives long after the fighting is over?
That's a really good question to think about. And if you're ready to explore those questions, you can find The Women by Kristin Hannah on Amazon and Audible.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Kristin Hannah's latest book. Until next time, keep exploring and keep learning.